It's not very common for a 26-year-old to write a memoir, but Sara El Sayed has a lot to say. Sous, as she's known to her family, was born in Alexandria in Egypt, where armed sentries stood guard at the front of her family's apartment building. When the El Sayeds emigrated to Australia, they left the guards behind, but there was still a lot of surveillance, a lot of rules, especially for the girls in the family. Rules like no bikinis, despite the Queensland heat, no boys, unless he's Muslim. Sara has written a tender, funny memoir about working out which of those commandments made sense for her to follow as she grew up. Her book is called Muddy People. Hi, Sara.
Hi, Sarah.
It is a great name, obviously, Sara, but where does your nickname, Sous, come from?
It's actually the Arabic word for cavity, so like a tooth cavity or decay. And my parents gave it to me when I was very young because I had a massive sweet tooth and I had many, many cavities in my teeth, fillings galore. Even now, I don't know why my teeth are just prone to decay. And so they called me Sue. It's an endearing term, but that's where it came from.
Well, Egyptian delicacies, I bet
Very sweet.
There's some good things to be eating.
Yes.
As I said, you were born in Alexandria. What memories do you have of Egypt?
It's very fragmented. I was 7 when we moved to Australia. So I do have memories of the place and some of my close family members. But sometimes I don't necessarily think that they're memories of me being there. They might be memories connected to photographs of that place. I have been back once since we moved to Australia when I was about 15 years old, but that was sort of a holiday trip, more touristy than anything. And I didn't really get to see a lot of the places where I grew up. So there are some memories, mostly related to family.
And as I say, there were guards outside your apartment building. Why was that?
Well, my mother told me there was a diplomat that lived on the top floor of our apartment building, and so they had guns that stood outside of our building. And it was never really a scary thing, anything like that. It was very normal. And they were just regular guys just standing there.
And you lived in an apartment building. What could you see from the windows of your home?
There was this park that sat right outside of our apartment building that mostly my grandmother would take me to, actually, and we'd walk through. But my dad took me there one time. My dad took me to that park once and we were walking through and I was very young. And, growing up bilingual, I feel like I have, there should be some leniency in terms of my ability to speak English or form words. But I came across this muddy puddle and I was screaming Sunny, it's sunny, sunny, sunny. And my dad was like, what are you talking about? And I'm like, it's sunny. And he's like, you don't mean sunny, you mean muddy. You've gotten the word wrong. That's so funny. And he repeats that story all the time, that I just can't speak English and it's wrong. And then so that's a really funny story to him. And it's also a funny story to me because it sort of articulates this idea of lack of clarity, complexity, opaqueness, it's just ability to get lost in translation. And I think all of those things really encompass a lot of the experiences we had as a family, but particularly my father had as an Arab man coming to Australia.
And what made your parents decide to move to Australia?
It was a number of things. They were struggling financially in terms of being able to provide for their children, but also a little bit of it was this anticipation of what would happen in Egypt eventually, 10 years later, which was the revolution. This sort of both economic and political uncertainty of the future of Egypt and whether they felt that that was the right place for their children to grow up. And so they made that decision because my mother had actually lived in Australia before. So she, as a child, from about 4 till 10 years old, lived in Melbourne with her parents. And so she was already an Australian citizen. So it was naturally the easiest move to make to the Western world was Australia.
What kind of memories did your mum have about Australia? How did she recall that time in her life?
It's really interesting when I talk to my mum about living in Australia as a child because she has really fond memories of it. She really loved it here. But she did experience a lot of difficulties as well. the way that the kids would call her. Like she said one kid that was like a bully, even though she was like half her friend, would call her like one big freckle because of the colour of her skin. And she said like the teachers at school would make her and the other WOG children wash the dishes in the staff room, which was so bizarre to me. Like that's just like, why? But then she remembers it so remembers other experiences of being here so fondly, and she really loves this country. So
she was keen to return. How did your parents go about choosing what part of Australia to move to?
Yeah, my dad had this really big, he printed it out, this like book of research that he had done about all the houses, all potential schools, places, suburbs all across Australia. And we sort of decided that potentially Brisbane would be the best at the time, cheaper to live here. And also it wasn't as cold. And my mum didn't really want to live in a cold place. And my grandmother is very much about the beach all the time, every day. So we thought Queensland was the best place for us to be.
So you were about 7 or so. What are your memories of that arrival in Brisbane?
Mm-hmm. I remember going to motel after motel, jumping in between places before we actually settled in a rental, and discovering all these things that we'd never seen before, like microwaves. Like we didn't have microwaves in Egypt, and toasters and square white bread. Like we didn't have that.
All of the culinary assets of Australia.
And it was so, because we'd seen things like toasters in cartoons, and we'd seen the bread like pop up really comically, like high in the air, and then the characters like catch them on plates. And we were like, oh, great. And then it would be so underwhelming when it would just, just come up like that. And those are my earliest memories of being here, and just the motels and being squashed into a room, all of us, and my first impression.
Alexandria is this huge, bustling, cosmopolitan city. What kind of contrast was that with where your family had landed?
Oh, yes, it seemed so empty here. The streets were empty. Like coming from the airport, that main drive was just, there is no one or nothing here. It seemed very clean. which was good, but there was just no noise. It just felt like a silence, and it was quite surreal. Yeah.
What did your parents do for work once they'd arrived in Australia?
So my father got a few contracts doing like bricklaying and some like construction work as a labourer, and my mother really struggled to find a job. So she was applying. So both my parents went to university and were working in Egypt. So my father was he studied architecture and engineering, and my mother was a doctor. But when they came here, their qualifications weren't recognised, and so my mother was applying for jobs like as a cashier at Woolworths and being rejected for those, and so that took a big toll on their confidence, like really knocked them back a bit. And my mum eventually, she went back to study so she could make up that gap of like education, so she could practice again in Australia, and she did that, which we're really proud of her for. But yeah, those first few months years even of them working through, coming to terms with, as professionals, letting go of what they thought they were and starting from scratch again was difficult. And
your dad going into working as a labourer here in Australia, that comes with a big drinking culture often. How did he, as an observant Muslim man, handle that?
Yeah, he tried to separate himself from it as much as possible, but at the same time tried to make those meaningful connections with his colleagues. I think he really, really tried, but some of those things, with the conversations that he had with them, either got lost in translation, or he felt like it was too much to be able to make friends with them outside of that culture.
What are some of the things he told you about that?
He told me that there was one instance where he'd offered to get everyone lunch on their smoko, and he was like, oh, what would you like? And then one of them said, like, this is not even like alcohol related, but like one of them said, oh, can you grab me a ginger beer? And he said, oh no, I can't do that. I'm not going to buy beer. I'm not going to buy alcohol. It's against my God. And they're like, no, like it's not beer. It's just ginger beer. And he's like, no, I'm not, whatever beer it is, I'm not going to get it. Like I refuse. And then that sort of awkward conversation is like well, then that affects their relationship and their friendship or potential friendships. And so that makes it his ability to communicate and his values sort of made it quite complex to form meaningful friendships at work. Yeah.
And what about you, Sara, starting school in this new environment, this new language? What are your memories of starting school in Brisbane?
Yeah, it was interesting. I mean, I already spoke English and it became my first language. So it wasn't necessarily like the ability to speak. I think it was just the understanding of culture and the things that we did here. That was the most difficult part of moving to a new place. What do these people do? And then what can I do? Like, what are my limits in terms of doing the same things that they do? That was the most difficult part.
Were there any other kids with Muslim or Arab families at your school?
In primary school, I don't really remember at my school, but there were children of the people that my father met at the mosque that I would come to know or become acquaintances with, that, you know, we sort of shared that understanding of religion and those expectations. But I came to find that our experiences were totally different because some of them were very devout and they went to schools where they had other Muslim kids around where I didn't. And so we were sort of a little bit separate from the community in that sense.
And as a little girl in this new environment, was there some sense, even on an unconscious level, that you felt you had to kind of choose between being Egyptian and being Australian? How did those two different worlds exist within you back then?
Yeah, I think I wanted both. Like, I love my family and I loved my family very much, but as a kid, you want everything that your friend's getting. So you're like, well, I want to do that too, and I want to go here, and I want to wear this. And just those conversations with my parents about, well, no, we don't do this. And at that age, as a child of 7 or 8 or 9, it's sort of difficult for them to articulate why, like the reasoning why that rule exists or that expectation exists. And it's not until you get older that you realize, okay, this is what they're thinking. And even though as an adult, maybe I don't agree with that, or I wouldn't fully adopt that as my parenting style if I were to ever have kids, that you can sort of see their justification behind it.
What instrument did you want to learn at school, Sara?
I wanted to play the saxophone because I thought it was so cool, and I thought of myself as Lisa Simpson, like the brown version of Lisa Simpson in every way. And so I really, really wanted to learn the saxophone, and I thought I would do it. And I auditioned for the band in grade 5, and we had like the levy scheme where you had to, like, if you paid like a small contribution, you could borrow one of the school's instruments, and that was the scheme that my parents accepted. And they didn't have any saxophones in the levy scheme. I had discovered that all of the kids who had saxophones, their parents had bought one for them. And my parents were not going to buy me a saxophone. And so I had to go and audition with like each and every mouthpiece that was available in the school. I tried trumpet and it was not good. And then I guess my lips were too loose for that. And then I tried the baritone, which is like a little tuba. And the teacher was like, great.
That's for you.
You have the lungs for this. So I did that, and I did that for years. I did that until year 12.
Tell me the instrument name.
It's a baritone, but there's like a little bigger version called a euphonium, and it sort of looks like a tuba. So it's like a bass instrument.
So not quite Lisa's saxophone.
No, unfortunately.
Where did you sit in the school orchestra?
At the back. I was the only girl in the back row for a very, very long time. And they say, the bass section is important. It sort of holds up the band, but it can be very boring and it's not as cool, as sexy as a saxophone, or even as cute or pretty as a flute. I just kind of wanted to be closer to the front, and I was at the back. It was fine. I accepted that position in the end.
You became friends with a boy at primary school. What challenges did that lead to at Tuck Shop?
Yeah, so this was actually in the first or second year of school in Australia, and Tuck Shop is all about scrolls. Another word that I was unfamiliar with, a scroll is like a bun of bread. Just think of scroll as like a piece of paper that you unravel, and it boggled my mind. But anyway, so he was talking about like bacon, cheese and bacon scrolls, and that I should get one because they're really good. And it's difficult for a child to have that conversation about, well, I can't get one because there's bacon on it, and bacon is pig, and pig is haram, and we don't eat pig because we're Muslim. And so just sort of be like, oh, maybe tomorrow, and sort of ignore it. But I did end up buying one at one point, but I never ate it. Just sort of trying to fit in, trying to appease your friends because you want to please them. But in my mind, I would never eat it. I would just sit in my bag.
Did anyone in your family find out about this haram roll or your friendship with this Australian boy?
Yeah, so my dad found out, not about the scroll, even though it was a bit smelly in my bag, but he must have smelled it. But he did find out about my friendship with this boy because I had a diary that I kept. Like I kept diaries all throughout my childhood because my grandmother encouraged me to write my diary. And I had written about him in my diary, and I drew a picture of us because I had a crush on him. Obviously, I had a crush on him, and I drew a picture of us like kissing, and like with me like with a little like bridal veil on it. I was like so in love with him, and I would hide my diary, but my dad found it one day. I don't know how, where, and he must have seen it, and so he had that conversation with me about we're Muslim, and Muslims marry Muslims, and with Muslim girls, like, we don't talk to, you're not friends with boys, be friends with girls. And at that age, it's sort of like, deep down, I sort of knew it. I knew that was the rule, but it was like, if I'm in this place now, surrounded by all these white people, these are my friends now, will I ever be able to comfortably or like freely be able to explore any type of romantic relationship? Obviously, I didn't articulate it like that in my mind as a 7-year-old. Will I ever be able to be allowed to have feelings like this? And it didn't seem possible at that time.
How do you remember reacting when, it's every child's nightmare, I think, your dad finding and reading your diary, particularly if you've drawn a picture of you kissing someone in a bridal veil? Were you embarrassed? Were you ashamed? What do you remember feeling?
Yeah, I felt really, really embarrassed. And it's sort of like it's this feeling that reoccurs every time I feel like I've done something that my parents wouldn't approve of. And it's like this gag in my throat, like I'm about to throw up, but I can't. And it's just like, you knew you weren't supposed to do that, but you did it, and now you're in trouble. And so, I was super embarrassed. And he was like, oh, you marry someone who's, Muslim. Like the only boy I knew who was a Muslim was my brother. So I was like, he's the only person I know. And he's like, oh, you can't marry a brother. I'm like, yeah, I know that, but who? Like, do I just, like, who is it? What's the possibility? And it was just really hard to imagine what my life could be like from there.
What kind of student were you at high school, Sara?
I think I was a people pleaser, trying to be a high achiever, trying to prove something of myself. I really wanted to be a school captain, and I was, and I tried really hard at school, and I tried really hard in my academics as well as social in terms of trying to fit in, and again, in a similar vein, please my peers, because I did have relationships with them. I did like them. It wasn't that they were awful people. I was like, oh, I guess I have to do what they say. It's like, no, I actually really liked these people, and this was my friend group. And so I'm not going to do things that will cause any upset for no reason. And so sometimes that involved going along with things that made me slightly uncomfortable, or things that they said that were jokes, but they weren't very nice, or they were offensive, sometimes racist. And I think that's something that a lot of migrant kids and kids of colour do, that it's hard to stand up in that moment and say, hey, I don't like that, stop it, even though that's what we're told to do. Often when it's coming from your friends, because usually it is coming from people who are closer to you rather than this like idea of like some external bully, like, you suck. Like, no, it's actually the people who are close to you. It's hard to be like, well, that really upsets me.
Tell me about the speech you made when you wanted to become school captain. What was your pitch to your classmates?
Oh, it was so awful. It was like, I mean, I try really hard to be funny and give them the permission to make fun of me too. So it would be things like the foundations of my campaign or my leadership will be as strong as the foundations of the pyramids of Giza, or like I'll blow up the system, like terrorist joke and like that, things like that you sort of, this internalized Islamophobia and racism that comes out when you're trying to give them a hall pass in terms of, I said it, you can too, make them feel comfortable, make them laugh, and like, oh, maybe she's cool, like she's fine with it, and vote for me.
Did it feel uncomfortable at the time, or is it looking back you're kind of aware of that fault line that you were trying to...
Yeah, it didn't feel, that's a funny thing, it didn't really feel uncomfortable at the time because it was something that I was so used to doing. Again, like in my day-to-day like friendship group, like you make these jokes and like, Sara said it, so it's fine, right? So it didn't feel uncomfortable, but looking back, it's like, let's unpack this. Like, why did I do that? And why did I think that I needed to do that to be successful?
Tell me about the English assignment that happened in grade 11. What was the project that you had to work on?
Yeah, so we were given a task to do a soapbox speech in year 11, and basically we had to be as persuasive as possible. So each student had to pick a topic, and we were encouraged to pick one that's like sexy or going to be controversial or like, pique interest. And so we were encouraged to pick things like abortion or like welfare or immigration. And so almost everyone chose something that was quite controversial. And I was tossing up between abortions. Should abortion be legalized, or should welfare exist? And it's sort of like the teacher was saying like, oh, you don't have to believe in what you write. You just have to be persuasive. You're being marked on your persuasive techniques. It doesn't matter what you write. And so I was like, okay. And the whole conversation because I was talking about it with my family about what I should pick, and we were discussing abortion, and that became a very, very hot topic. And my grandma and my dad had this big row over it. They have very, very differing viewpoints, and she sometimes likes to poke a little bit, which is fine. That's her personality. But one of my good friends actually picked the topic of why Muslims shouldn't be allowed to immigrate to Australia. And at the time it was like, oh, we don't have to believe in this topic. We don't have to. She's just trying to get a good mark. But, deep down you think, well, there were so many other topics, and this is like meant to be your best friend. Why would you choose this? So that was an interesting moment as well.
Did the teacher facilitate that at all, or how was that handled in the classroom? You've got a Muslim kid there and someone else in the class giving a speech why Muslims shouldn't be allowed to immigrate to Australia.
Well, I wasn't aware of any effort to stop her from writing about that topic, in the same way that some people got up and talked about how gay people shouldn't be married, and we had gay people in our class. And it was sort of like, that was uncomfortable for them too, in the same way that it was uncomfortable for me. And so you sort of put these children in the position of, well, you need to just listen and forget about the content. Let's look at the persuasive techniques. And so difficult for a 16-year-old to really process that.
Did you ever talk to your friend about the speech she made?
Yeah, I did. She actually did reach out to me about it a little while ago, and she did apologize because upon reflection, she did see that it was the wrong thing to do and that she wouldn't, obviously in this day, wouldn't do it, and she wished that she didn't do it. And so I did appreciate that. And in a way I do understand, because we were all 16-year-olds and we were told to do this. It wasn't like she did have a choice in terms of what topic she picked, but it was the task we were given as part of our Year 11 assessment. It's tricky, and I hope these tasks aren't still in schools. I hope that students aren't still being asked to lean into controversial but potentially really harmful opinions just for the sake of getting a mark.
Your dad laid out a lot of rules for you about what was okay, what wasn't, including swimwear, and bikinis were definitely a no-no. How did you go about, though, getting yourself a bikini as a teenager?
I bought it myself. I was living in Harvey Bay at the time, and Big W had just opened. And so I went and got a bikini without my parents' knowledge, and I wore it under my uniform on a day when it was like one of the last days of school when the school would take you to either go see a movie or go to the beach. And so I really wanted to wear it, so I sort of sneakily bought one.
And how did that go?
Not very well. I got my period on that day.
Every teenage girl has had a version of this terrible experience.
Literally. And I really thought that was God or the universe saying, like, you did the wrong thing, you went against your parents, therefore you're not swimming today.
You are menstruating.
Yeah.
Here you go.
Yeah, exactly. That's this fear that I've had my whole life as a child and as a teenager, is that there is someone watching you. Whatever you do, there is someone watching you, so you need to do the right thing.
Broadcast, podcast. This is Conversations with Sara Kanowski. You can follow Conversations on the ABC Listen app or wherever you get your podcasts.
So bikinis were definitely a no-no. What about the hijab? Were there women in your family who wore the hijab?
No, also my mother and my maternal grandmother never did. My paternal grandmother did only when she turned 40, so she was a little bit older. Yeah, it was never something that my mother wanted to do, and it was definitely something my grandmother didn't want to do. There was one man who proposed to my mother before she met my father, and he said that he would marry her if she were to wear a scarf, and she said no.
What did your grandma, your mum's mum, think about that condition?
She was very, very angry. She said for him to stick a shoe up his ass or something like that. Because, it's a woman's choice. And they didn't want to. And it wasn't this grand thing of, I reject it and I don't see it why I need to. It's just we don't want to. And that men, and especially men that want to make a life with them, need to accept that. My father is a little bit more conservative than my mother and my mother's side, even though my mother is still quite a devout Muslim. I don't think he would say no if his wife or his children were to say, well, I want to wear hijab, but he would never force us to do that.
Were you able to see how it would have meant something to him in terms of forming a new community in this country where you were the minority? How did you see him noticing other families when you were out and about with your dad?
Yeah, so there's a shopping centre in Underwood that was very close to a lot of the Muslim community. And so we'd go there because it was the only place with a halal butcher. And so we'd travel to go there most weekends. And around there you'd see families with daughters who were wearing hijab. And my dad was always, if you walk with him, you can see him whenever he sees a Muslim man or a Muslim woman, he'll nod and smile at them just to let them know that he's also Muslim. And so I feel he never said anything, but it's just those types of moments. And well, if you were to see me walking down the street, he wouldn't nod at me if I was a stranger. He wouldn't feel connected to me in any way. So I think it's a symbol of connection, of community to him. But he would never force me to do that.
The rules that your dad was explicit with you about when it came to boys, right back from when you were at primary school, were those rules the same for your brother Muhammad?
No. No, they weren't. My brother never really... Well, maybe while he was in high school, he did feel a similar pressure to not date or not form romantic relationships with people because he never brought it up. But that just might be his personality of being quite reserved and private about things. But in terms of after high school for him, he did have a girlfriend, and my dad wasn't angry about it. She was white. She is white. She's still his girlfriend. when my dad found out about it, he was very interested in meeting her and making her a part of the family, because he's all about to do good things. You do them in what he says, like the light. You do them in the light, you don't do them in the darkness, which is what I felt like a lot of the things that I felt and that I felt like I needed to do were in the darkness. So that's sort of him saying, like, if there's something you need to tell me, you need to tell me. But yeah, do it in the light. And so he was very much about putting my brother and his girlfriend in the light. And that's been his goal since then.
You grew up, as you say, bilingual, and then English, after you come to Australia, English becomes your first language. What did that mean for communication with your dad?
Yeah, my dad speaks to me in Arabic and I respond in English, which is, yeah, it's a bit embarrassing sometimes that I've lost this language. I mean,
but
I understand
you can
him.
understand it.
I understand him perfectly, but I only understand like the Egyptian dialect of Arabic. So if I listen to someone who's speaking the Lebanese dialect, for example, I can figure it out, I can decode it, but it sort of sounds like, you know, like Pig Latin, where like things are jumbled or like consonants are changed. And so sometimes I can't really understand Lebanese dialect. I can understand Egyptian dialect perfectly, but it takes time for me to form a sentence in my mind to be able to speak a response. And so I just respond in English. It's sort of like this guilty feeling that I've had since I lost it. So I lost it when I was quite young. Like I started this habit of responding in English when I was quite young. And the moment that made me most embarrassed or feel the most guilty was when my paternal grandmother, she would visit us every year. And she didn't speak English. And every year I could feel my ability to speak to her like just slowly like sanded away. And it was embarrassing that I couldn't do that.
Embarrassing or upsetting?
Both, yeah. It was embarrassing because my grandmother would expect me to do it. And so like when I couldn't do it, it was like I'm sort of like a bit of a failure, but also upsetting in the sense that this is a skill that I thought that I had. You know, I don't have it anymore.
What happened to your mum and dad's marriage in Australia?
So they got divorced in 2012, end of 2012. And that was the year I was in year 12. It was a big thing. It was a lot of fighting that led up to it. And it came to the point where as kids, or I guess I could speak for myself, but I didn't see them together anymore. Like it was like you just want them to be apart, because I came to realize that they really just weren't compatible. Maybe they were at one time, I don't know, although I do struggle to see it, but they just were better apart than together.
What was it like then visiting your dad in his new place where he lived alone?
He moved to the Northern Territory. First he moved to North Queensland, but then he moved to the Northern Territory, and I never visited him in the Northern Territory. He stayed there for years, but he would come down. He would come over to us in Queensland to see us. So I never saw him in those really difficult moments when he was alone, and some of those moments is when he became really unwell. Again, that's another point of I feel like I did fail him as a daughter at times, because he was so alone, and it was the darkest period of his life, that he says, the most difficult period of his life. I didn't make the effort to be there.
How did things change after he began getting treatment for his cancer?
Yeah, he decided to get treatment at the Gold Coast Hospital. So we lived in Queensland, so I would go with him to all of his chemo sessions. So he was sitting in a chair, so the way he got his chemo was sitting in a chair, and it would be directly into his veins like that. So I would get a chair next to him, and I would sit there, and it would take hours. But during that time, we would talk to each other, and my father was already in this very vulnerable state in terms of his health and feeling quite weak and emotional. And so I think those moments just allowed him to open up a little bit to me, and for us to get to know each other a little bit better in different circumstances, because he was completely changed. And, you know, I felt like I had been changing for a while. So obviously I wish that he wasn't unwell, that he didn't have to go through that. But the silver lining is that we did have those moments together.
What other side did you see of your dad in that different setting?
There are a few. One was that sometimes he got really quite angry. He would say that it was like the chemicals, that they made him really agitated. And so he had a really short temper. Sometimes he would get quite emotional because he was reflecting on the possibility, or maybe this is it for him, maybe this disease will take his life. And so I think he really wanted to make sure that his daughters in particular were taken care of in the most reasonable sense, taken care of before he would pass away.
What did that mean for him, for you to be taken care of? What did that look like?
To be married to a man, to a Muslim man, and to have me off his hands, because that's the sort of...
Is that the phrase he used?
Yeah. I mean, like, to be able to pass me on to someone else to deal with. That's really, in his mind, the way that he can be sure that I'm safe and comfortable is that if the main man in my life, my father, were to be gone, then he felt like I needed someone else.
What kind of husband did he want for you? What were his guidelines for a good match?
Obviously, he wanted someone who was like, had a job, wasn't a nice person. But the main thing was that he was a Muslim. And I always knew that, again, from that diary moment, that I always knew that I would have to marry someone who was Muslim.
How did you feel about that, those series of qualities, like a nice person, a job, but most importantly must be a Muslim? What did that feel like, that criteria for you?
It felt like a really low bar, to be honest, because there are so many other things that a quality of a partner that, that could be so great, but if they don't have this one thing, then it's sort of out the window. And so, like, would he accept someone who's like, oh, yeah, so-and-so, like, maybe he's fine. Like, to me, he seems okay, but he's a Muslim, so it's, go ahead. Yeah, I felt like it was just like the criteria was really, really basic. Yeah, it did upset me because he did try to set me up with people. He did try to sort of introduce. Have you seen My Big Fat Greek Wedding?
Yeah, I have.
When like she's setting the table and then like they're going through having like all these suitors come through in that montage. Sort of like what it felt like when he would like invite people.
So how would he go about setting you up? What was the setting? Or how would that happen?
There were a few strategies. So once he had two men who were his friends, quote unquote friends, come to his house for like a barbecue, like for a lunch. And I remember saying to my sister, like, oh, I know he's inviting these people because he wants to see who I'll be quote unquote friends with. And she's like, as if, like, you think too much of yourself. Like, just, they're just his friends. And then it actually came out that a couple of months later, one of them got in touch with him and was like, I would really like to get to know Sara more. And I was like, I told you that this was a setup. But
what kind of men were they? Were they people that you might have had things in common with, or could you see from your dad's eyes why he was selecting these men?
They were Muslim and they were professional. Like, they did have jobs and they were, like, quite well educated. So I can see from his perspective they were, like, quite, like, his type of guy. I'll have to say, like, I didn't give them a chance. Like, I didn't talk to them and I didn't want to because I knew that I would never accept that way of, trying to be introduced to someone. I always thought that the person I would marry was someone who I was already friends with, someone that I'd already established this connection with.
What kind of conversation did you have with your dad after those unsuccessful setting ups?
There were quite a few. So there were quite a few setups. There was the dinner ones, and then there was ones where he would just sort of text me about someone on Facebook, and it sort of got to the point where at one stage I was like, I can't. Like, it's too uncomfortable. Every time that he brings it up, it would make me very, very uncomfortable. And so I just said to him, like, look, I'm not going to marry anyone that comes to me in this way. Very likely the person I'm going to marry is someone that I already know and someone that I'm already friends with, and it's very likely that that person's going to be white. And then, like, as I was saying that, like, on the phone, I was, like, crying because I was, like, so fearful. I was so fearful that he would say, that's not going to happen. But he said, don't cry. Why are you crying? Like, don't cry. And but he said, like, you know the rules, like, that he has to be Muslim. And I said, like, yes, I know, but you just have to accept that it's not going to be one of these people.
And you were fearful that he would try to make you, or fearful that it would destroy your relationship with your dad?
I was fearful that it would destroy my relationship. I know that he would never force me. He would never force me to do anything. But I was fearful that he would not want to talk to me anymore. Because that's what I saw, and not in the same circumstances, but that's what I saw with, or what I heard with my mother and her father and their relationship, that they were estranged because she sort of pushed a boundary that, was too much for him. And he said, "You're not my daughter anymore." So always in the back of my mind, it's like, what's that boundary for me? How far will I push my father to the point that, he'll say, "Not for me," yeah.
As you were growing up, you were getting a very different take on marriage and men from your nana than you were getting from your dad. What was her advice when it came to love?
My grandmother is anti-man. She's funny. And she and my father don't get along at all. She was married a few times, but she suffered financial abuse from her husband, to my mother's father. And that was her first marriage, and it sort of made her very aware of her rights as a woman and to be very protective of herself and her child. And so I understand where that position comes from, because this man totally controlled her life. Even though I feel like, the men in my life made these rules for me. For her, it was a very tangible thing. She physically couldn't go and buy things for herself or her daughter from her own money that she made. And so she was very angry about that, rightfully so. She married a few times after that, but she's always had this very strong stance of a woman needs to be independent, have control of her own money, and any man who tries to tell her how to live her life can get, She comes from a different path of experience.
She was the person, your grandma, who started you writing when she gave you a diary when you were 8. What kind of things did you write in it at first, Sara?
I would write boring things.
When you're 8, there's not always that much to narrate.
Yeah, I would just record what happens in the day, and that was about it. Nana would read it and then say, it's not very exciting, is it? And so she wouldn't tell me to lie about it, but she would tell me to sort of infuse a little bit of creativity into the way that I write and the way that I perceive the world by extension, it's not just all clear cut. There are things that you can imagine and that you can feel that other people don't necessarily see as there.
What kind of things would she suggest you embellish?
Because we were at the park and I saw a butterfly. So I wrote, we were in the park and I saw a butterfly. And she would say, "That's really boring. Write about how the butterfly came up and kissed you, kissed your cheek." And I was like, "What? It didn't." She's like, "Yes, it did. Just write about it that way. So you can look back and think, well, how exciting was my life and how beautiful was my life." She's teaching me how to lie. But it is a way of seeing the beauty or the flair in everyday moments that she really brings.
And I guess using your imagination to recast some of the experiences around you. Though I wonder if it means we should be taking your book, Muddy People, with a grain of salt. How closely have you followed your Nana's directives?
Yeah, I think that exactly. That's a thing with this genre, right? In creative nonfiction, that we're telling a story and that there are parts of it that are, for narrative purposes, been, what word we use, streamlined, but also parts that I've allowed myself to be able to see moments with that more whimsical impression of life, to be able to perceive things in a way that it is driven by feeling rather than driven by pure fact or recount, because that's how we tell a story. Sometimes memories are just memories of photographs. They're not real memories. And so a lot of the things that we tell ourselves and what we believe to be true are also embellished. So I think she understood that.
Did you have to muster a kind of courage, Sara, to write about your family in the way you have? What kind of leap was that for you?
Absolutely. I was really, really anxious about writing about my dad, and I was really anxious about how he would take the work. So that was in the back of my mind the whole time I was writing. Well, I'm going to have to show my dad this one time. So I have to be careful about what I write. And also to my mum and also to my grandmother, because I love them all and I respect them all, so I don't want to upset them in any way. But I also want to be honest. And I want to tell a story that's meaningful. So it was about balancing that line of, let me write what I feel and write what I remember, and then, like, write the whole thing. And then let's talk about it together, about what they feel comfortable with and what they don't.
What do they think of the book?
My dad absolutely loved it, and that was a big surprise to me. As I said, I wrote the whole draft, and then I went through it with him, and he did kind of go through it with like a sticky notes and highlighter and making sure that we talked about each point. But there really wasn't a lot of change in terms of him saying, oh, I don't want this in there. It was sort of like there was one line that my grandmother said, so like a line of dialogue that my grandmother said about him. And she did say that. And he said, oh, I don't think you should put this in there because it might make people think that this is true and then all Arab men are like this. And I said, well, that's what she said. And I can't change what she said. This is like from her character, from her voice. And I would hope that people don't take that and characterize a whole, culture of people. But I could be naive and wrong that they might do that. But this is her character. This is what she would say. So having those conversations, but there wasn't anything that he was like, absolutely not. My mother was a bit different. She didn't want to read it, didn't want to read the draft. I sort of gave her a summary of each chapter to make sure that she knew what was in it, particularly regarding the things with her father. It was quite recent that he had passed away. So I wanted to make sure that she was comfortable with me writing about that. So I just gave her a summary of what each chapter was about. She said, that's fine. And then she read it when it was published for the first time. And it was interesting. She liked it, but she said I should have been more harsh on my father. She felt like I was a bit too gentle. Obviously, my grandmother loved it.
Well, she comes across as a star, your grandma. Do you think, given what you've been saying about how conscious you were of your dad's opinion and judgment and criteria for your behaviour, do you think that he got a new appreciation of you and what things had been like for you by reading the book?
I think so. I'd like to think so. That there were parts in there that I've never discussed with him. And the same with my mother. I've never discussed a lot of the things that we talked about, because even if they are involved in the scenes or the chapters, the thoughts behind them, I never expressed to them. Both of them got a better understanding of who I am, my experiences as their child. I also think that my father got a better sense of my impression of him, because I didn't want it to be like, oh, he's this forbidding father setting all these rules and expectations and, oh, I'm really resentful of him for this. It's actually that I really love my father, and that I think that he's this like really unique person. He comes with a lot of baggage, as most fathers do, and he has these values in this culture that he holds so dear. He's trying to pass on to his kids. But he's also like this very emotional person, and he loves his kids so fiercely that I just wanted that to come through as well. So I was really pleased with his impression of it, and also I think that he got the message that that's how I feel about him too.
You'd said that when it came to him wanting to set you up with a Muslim man to marry, that you had this fear that it would rupture your relationship if you said no, that there'd be some boundary you'd cross that would be too much for him. Do you still have that fear?
I mean, now I have my partner, and now I have sort of met the expectations of my father. So he's very happy. My partner, Aaron, so I met him in high school. I've known him for a very, very long time. So when I'm saying that the person I'm going to marry is someone who I'm already friends with, I think he understood what that meant. So Aaron is so lovely and accepts everything that I am and embraces it as his own as well, which is really lovely. And that really pleases my dad. So it's not like I went against my father's expectations in any way.
How did the first meeting between Aaron and your dad go?
It was quite sweet, but also a little bit intense because I think they were both really, really nervous. So we're a family of 3. So my brother's the eldest, I'm middle, and my sister is younger. And so it was like his daughter, like the first one, introducing like a man to him. And so he was quite nervous. But I think they sort of bonded over the fact that Aaron was an engineer and then my dad was an engineer. And so they were sort of like talking engineer stuff, which is nice. But they do get along, and I'm glad. But I do sometimes wonder, like, if I never found someone who was willing to accept this criteria, what would happen?
So he is an engineer, so there's certain qualities that are right from your dad's point of view, but, you know, he's not Egyptian, he's not a Muslim.
He is. He is now. He is a Muslim now. So we did do he's not Egyptian, he's Australian, but we did do like the ceremony where we got married in the eyes of God. And so he did accept that. And that was something that we had talked about in terms of if we were ever to bring this relationship to the light, as what my father says, that this is something that it would be too difficult for me to work around. I'm not willing to, upset my father in this way. So that was a conversation that we had, and he was willing to accept that as part of me and as part of my family. So yeah, I'm really pleased that he did that. But Aaron knows the things that I found difficult in growing up. And as I said before, it's like this process of coming to understand why my parents put these expectations on me. What was the justification behind them? And sometimes I can see like, oh, I understand why. And I somewhat agree. I understand, but I don't agree. Or I would do something different. We want our kids, if we were to ever have children, to be good people, ultimately. And that doesn't necessarily mean following this particular set of rules. I guess we just have to come to terms with what we define and what we think is a good person.
You've written a really wonderful book. Thank you so much for being my guest on Conversations.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Sara El Sayed was my guest on Conversations today. Sara's book is called Muddy People. I'm Sarah Kanowski. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode of Conversations, then have a look at our playlist here and choose another episode to listen to. Or you can follow Conversations on the ABC Listen app and create your own playlist so you can listen to us anywhere, anytime that suits you.